Hello. Thank you for joining us today for the AWWA webinar on Effective Utility Management, Your Utility's Road to Sustainability. We'd like to thank our 2017 webinar sponsors, Badger Meter, Woodard & Curran, Utility Cloud, and Census. My name is Stephanie Passarelli, and I'm an engineer at American Water Works Association. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Here are some tips to enhance your webinar experience. We recommend you close email, instant messengers, and any other programs not currently in use, as they may interfere with the smooth reception of the webinar, causing slide buffering and poor sound quality. Technical assistance can be found at the GoToWebinar technical support page at the link listed in your handouts and on the slide shown. Following the webinar, as you close the GoToWebinar screen, a window will open with a survey questionnaire. We ask that all of you take a few minutes to answer the survey questions. Your feedback is important to us and helps us improve webinar programming. We encourage group participants to pick one person to enter collective responses to the survey and submit them to us. Before we hear from our speakers, we'd like to inform you that the mention of specific products or services in this webinar does not represent AWWA endorsement. AWWA does not endorse or improve products or services. I am pleased to introduce our distinguished panel of experts for today's program, Jim Horn, Liesl Gross, and Rob Greenwood. Today's webinar highlights utility management's value and importance based on the attributes of effectively managed utilities and the keys to management success, which AWWA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and several leading water sector associations endorse. The webinar's focus is to familiarize the audience with the steps needed to implement EUM according to the recently updated EUM Primer released in January 2017. In the United States, EUM is now the most widely recognized water utility management program, helping utilities address challenges they face today and preparing them to meet challenges of the future. Participants will gain understanding of the basic structure of EUM and especially how to get started in implementing the EUM approach in their operations through the three basic steps described in the primer, which are assessing current utility operations based on the attributes, adopting best management practices based on the assessment, and selecting performance metrics to gauge performance improvements. Our panel will be happy to answer your questions. Feel free to submit questions anytime throughout this broadcast by using the question pane at the lower right of your screen. Please include your name, city where you are viewing the webinar, and the name of the panelist to whom your question should be directed. Let's begin. Jim Horn is a Sustainability Program Manager at the U.S. EPA Office of Water. Jim will be covering the opening remarks. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you very much to the group of people that have joined us today. We really appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of EPA, and I certainly want to thank our great colleagues at AWWA. It's a real pleasure to work with the staff. They are really top-notch. Stephanie and I have worked together. I also want to thank Rachel for all her help. Things go very smoothly with AWWA, and we really appreciate it. So again, I'm delighted to be here. I will be brief in my remarks, really to give you a very brief history of effective utility management. And if we could go to that slide, Morgan, that has the collaborating organizations on the front, please. This first slide is just meant to illustrate the widespread support that EUM has around the country. It really started as a coalition of about 6 organizations and has now expanded to all of the organizations that you see on this particular slide. I think that's a testimony to its value, but also its longevity. As we all know, things are changing and always changing rapidly in the water and wastewater industry, but the staying power of this coalition is really something that's very important EPA was proud to be one of the charter members, I guess, if you will, of the coalition, as was AWWA, and we are very pleased to be part of that. It remains very much a foundational part of the work that we do here at EPA to promote effective and sustainable utility management, because I feel EUM is really the first step in helping a utility, regardless of your size or whether you're water, wastewater, combined, stormwater, move toward really a sustainable state, if you will. So the next slide really talks a little bit about why we're here today, and I'll be very brief here. I gave you a little bit of a history of EUM, and I'm not going to say too much more about that other than, as Stephanie mentioned, it's really based around what we call the attributes of effectively managed utilities and keys to management success, which Rob Greenwood will describe in much more detail during the bulk of the webinar. We're really here today to take you through what we call the EUM Primer document, which was originally published back in 2008, and it was just recently updated by a group of utility leaders, again, both water and wastewater from around the country, earlier this year. And it's really a much improved document and describes those three basic phases that Stephanie mentioned: assessment of current operations, identification of or benchmarking of practices, specifically utility management practices based on the assessment, and then the identification of potential performance metrics. So we like to call that the effective utility management cycle. So as I read through the document, I'm always amazed at how useful it is, and we were pleased to sort of facilitate the process of revising it. We will again take you through the self-assessment exercise and the other components of that cycle during the course of the webinar. All across the country, I'm very pleased to say people are no longer scratching their heads for the most part when we mention the term EUM. And I think that's in large part due to the coalition that I mentioned earlier. It has become part and parcel of the Utility Management Conference that AWWA and WEF sort of trade off managing each year. It's also a very important part of many other efforts. I happen to be this week at the AWWA Summer Conference in St. Louis, and so people are really strongly behind this, recognize it, and are using it very effectively. So what I really want to do is briefly just say what the EUM Primer can help you to do. And Morgan, if you could just bring up that slide, because this is really, I don't want to stress too much the history and the grand coalition, but really to say, based on the document and based on the utility leaders that helped put it together, here's what it really helps you take that, what I like to call the 360-degree look at your utility's current operations. It doesn't make judgments about where you are. That's not the point. It's to let you figure out where you are and what your priorities are. It lets you set the priorities for those things that are important to you and to your community. So it really stresses the value of understanding what the community priorities are, what they are expecting of you, and what you're in the best position to deliver. It really says, okay, where are we strong? Where can we improve? And let's chart a course for improvement. Another really important part of the entire EUM exercise, as I call it, is it really helps you move away from the hot priorities of the week. We all know what those are. Believe me, we have those in our organization in spades, and I'm sure you do too. This says take a step back, take the long view, really take an objective and calm and reasonable sort of look at your utility to move away from that highly reactive mode into a more proactive, planning, long-term visionary mode. It really helps you retain, recruit, and motivate a workforce, because really this is something, the assessment that Rob will describe is something that really needs to involve people at all levels of the organization. And there is a very strong emphasis in EUM about what we call employee leadership and development. We all know the workforce challenges that virtually every utility in the country is facing. And as you'll see in the document, that's a very important part of the primer, and there's really a lot of great information. So I want to mention that as well. We all have infrastructure investments in the ground, very, very important, vital investments. Using the EUM approach allows you to protect what you've got and really to plan proactively and intelligently for what you need to build going in the future. Not with the assumption that what you've always built or what you've always had is the right thing, but with an eye toward what you need today and what you'll need, 10, 15, 20 years out. So there's a strong element of sort of strategic business planning built into this as well. And again, as it's always said, you can't really improve what you can't measure. So there's a very strong emphasis on measurement. As Stephanie mentioned, sort of the third leg of the EUM cycle is really looking at what types of performance measures you think are appropriate for your document. So the primer has a very strong section that lays out a number of potential measures that you can consider based on each of the 10 attributes. It doesn't say you have to use these. These are suggestions for measures to look at from the panel of utility leaders that helped us put together the document. The important thing is to measure something that's important to you that really helps you achieve your strategic objectives. This is really something you can do within your utility. I have great respect for the consulting community out there, but this is really designed to be something that can be self-implemented. It's, as I like to say, it's simple but not simplistic. It really takes you through that process that you can undertake, that your staff can understand and build upon over time. It doesn't say you have to do everything at once. It's a progression-based approach based on your priorities, but we really urge utilities to do it in-house. It really can work for you. So let me just wind up by thanking everybody again. This is a great opportunity to partner with an organization that we have great respect for here at EPA, AWWA, and we look forward to working more with you in the future and really helping you more and more utilities around the country implement and sort of see the benefits that we've seen from EUM. So with that, let me turn it over to our next speaker, Liesl Gross, who is the CEO of Lehigh Valley Water in Lehigh Valley, or I guess Allentown, Pennsylvania. Liesl, delighted to have Liesl here to really give you an overview of kind of her experience at her utility and using EUM. So Liesl, I'll turn it over to you. And again, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate the introduction and the great background and all your work on developing the EUM program for utilities. I'm going to provide a little bit of a background of our organization and give you sort of the utility perspective of how the Effective Utility Management Framework has worked for our organization. But I'll start with a brief history on the next slide of the organization to set the framework for where we were when we started down this path. Back in actually 51 years ago, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary. In 1966, we were formed by the County of Lehigh in a real entrepreneurial sort of spirit, in that the Lehigh Valley was undergoing some major transformation with industries moving out of the urban core and out into the suburbs. And the county decided to form a water authority to help provide utility services that would support the economic development that was going on in the region. And we carried that entrepreneurial spirit forward over the next 50 years, I would say, as the organization grew and as our service territory grew. We were certainly an early adopter in the 70s and 80s of quality management programs like the Total Quality Management Initiative, EQUIP training, which is a team-based training initiative. And when the American Water Works Association came out with their QualServe program in the mid-1990s, Lehigh County Authority was one of the very early adopters of that program. So, you know, over time, we had really developed a long history of doing things like strategic planning, benchmarking, overall quality management initiatives, and developing ourselves as an industry leader and providing excellence in financial management and having a very strong organization while we're staying small and nimble. By the early 2000s, we had 20,000 customers and on both water and wastewater, and only 39 employees. So keeping ourselves really small and nimble and ready for all the challenges that were ahead of us was a key important strategy that we employed. And then on the next slide, we talk a little bit about what happened in 2012. This is a banner year for our organization. A series of major changes happened, the most significant of which is the regional system merger that happened when the city of Allentown placed their water and sewer systems up for a 50-year concession lease. And the lease arrangement was put out there for the city to address pension debt that they had accrued, but trying to leverage their water and sewer system to address that pension debt. So based on our service history in the region, as well as our financial strategies and tax-exempt status, we were able to win the competitive bid process, even though we were the only local small public organization in the running. We were successful. Overnight, almost, seemed like overnight, in 90 days, we tripled our customer base and quintupled our employee base. Went from 39 employees up to almost 160 employees that we have today. We also engaged in this very complex lease arrangement that involved a whole lot of different measures, different things that we needed to report to both regulators and the city of Allentown itself as the owners of the system, and had a lot more challenges that we were facing that were outside of our control, such as how we develop rates and how we manage our infrastructure. At the same time, we were also transitioning to a unionized workforce. We have two unions now, whereas in the past we had none. And sort of as we began to get through that transition period, we also faced significant leadership turnover. Our prior chief executive officer retired at the end of 2015. We also had turnover in key leadership positions in finance, operations, our engineering capital works department, IT, pretty much across the board, even customer service. So that really put us in a position where we felt a little confused about what our future was going to look like. A lot of new leadership in place, a very different operating environment than we'd had in the past 50 years. So to say we were directionless is probably inaccurate, but certainly we were a bit overwhelmed. And developing goals became a real challenge for us because we were a much larger organization than we were in the past, and trying to figure out how to focus ourselves was a real challenge. So we found the effective utility management framework through our industry involvement in various associations, and really saw this as an opportunity to gain some focus and direct our goal setting and strategic planning process into a framework that had a lot of industry backing and a lot of great history and best practices built into it. This wheel, I think you'll see in a future slide as well, but really spoke to us in terms of identifying what the 10 attributes are of an effectively managed utility and those 5 keys to success. What we loved about the primer also was the measures that were in the appendix and giving us an overall framework to develop our goals and set a continuous improvement strategy in place. So now we can focus. One of the first things that we did was to go through the assessment process, what I believe Rob is going to talk to you about in a little bit. But the assessment process was something that we did with all of our managers, and we asked for broad employee input as well. And through that process, we were able to identify of the 10 attributes of an effectively managed utility, which ones are most important for us to achieve and focus on now, and which of those attributes were we struggling with the most in terms of performance. And in general, I mean, that's the basic kind of way to do the assessment. And we came up with these 4 primary goal areas, which are the 4 attributes in the EUM framework of product quality, financial viability, infrastructure stability, and employee leadership and development. And within those 4 goal areas, we also further defined specifically for our organization, what did we need to focus on to achieve the improvements for the organization that we wanted to. So on this slide, I'm showing a variety of things that we focused on, but they really do fall within the best management practices of the industry. Certainly maintaining our systems to eliminate sanitary sewer overflows, achieve affordability with rates, implement an asset management program, and develop our employees and put together a workforce and succession planning initiative all fit within those best practices within the industry. So in addition to those 4 goal categories, we also established one more longer-term sort of goal for us for 2017, and that is this whole strategic planning kind of initiative and using the EUM framework for that. So through 2017, what we're hoping to achieve is not only to define what those goals are, which we've already done, but to establish measures for each of the attribute areas that we've selected. And the Primer and the 80+ benchmarks that are included there have been a huge help to us in doing that. We're looking to leverage technology within all the goal areas. For us, that has become one of the key strategies for all of our goal achievement. And then we're also looking just a little bit longer term than the 1-year time horizon. We don't think that we're ready for a 5 or 10-year plan at this point because we're just getting started with it. So we're looking at 3 years. We're looking at the year 2020 and trying to define what our vision is and what our organization wants to look like in the year 2020 so that we can develop actual action plans for each of these areas within that time period. And then finally, to involve the community, our board, our employees on these discussions, really, we believe will help us to further define and create a little bit better focus in each of those areas, and maybe identify 1 or 2 other areas that we've missed along the way with our internal assessment. So all of these things we believe will work together to focus us in moving in a single direction together as a single organization and build that culture of continuous improvement that has always been part of our culture, but giving us the focus now as a much different organization than we were just 4 short years ago, and really have appreciated the opportunity to use the EUM framework to help us get there. That's a very brief overview of Lehigh County Authority and how we've been able to use the EUM framework thus far. We certainly have an awful lot of work to do yet in the years ahead, and look forward to doing that. And I will echo Jim's comment that he made at the end of his comments, that this is really something that we as an organization were able to do ourselves. We did ask for some outside help where we felt we needed it on some of the measures, but for the most part, the ability to define our goals and to understand what we need to do to get to the next level of performance as an organization comes from within our own ranks and from within our own organization. And the EUM framework just helped us to do that in a facilitated and organized manner. So it's a great tool. Thank you very much for allowing me to present, and I will turn it over to our next presenter, who is Rob Greenwood.
Thank you, Liesl. Thanks for sharing Lehigh's experience with using the EUM framework. This has been very helpful to see the implementation, goals, and results at the utility level. As a quick reminder before we go to Rob, to our audience, please submit any questions using the questions pane at any time during the live broadcast. We'll circle back to those after our final presentation. And as Liesl mentioned, our final presenter is Rob Greenwood. He is a principal at Ross Strategic, and Rob will be covering effective utility management. What's it all about? Go ahead, Rob.
Great. Thanks very much, Stephanie. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. As has been previously mentioned, I'm going to spend some time here talking about the core aspects of effective utility management and the Primer, which has been updated and re-released as of January of this year. Liesl already had presented this wheel and mentioned that you'd be seeing it again, but we'll go ahead and pause here for a minute and let me go through this in a little bit more detail. Effective utility management, which has been around since about 2007, initially developed through an extensive amount of case example / case study work with utilities around the country, identifying effective practices and where they focus their attention. Those case examples then were the backdrop for a convening of national experts and leaders in the water sector. And through those discussions emerged the concept of the 10 attributes of effective utility management. They've been slightly modified and updated as part of the 2017 release. But the idea here is that the 10 attributes, which are the spokes of the wheel that you're looking at, product quality, customer satisfaction, employee and leadership development, operational optimization, financial viability, infrastructure strategy and performance, enterprise resiliency, community sustainability, water resource sustainability, and stakeholder understanding and support, are designed to cover the full range of operational priorities that a well-run utility needs to pay attention to. And in implementing EUM over the last 10 years and working with utilities, we've consistently found that these 10 attributes cover the landscape for utilities, that they can, what they want to see as priorities can find a home within the context of these 10 attributes. Also, there's the 5 keys to management success. Again, these have been updated as well as part of the 2017 release of the Primer. So we have leadership, strategic business planning, knowledge management, measurement, and continual improvement management. And these overlap substantially with each other. And knowledge management is a kind of a new area in terms of the 5 keys that has additional emphasis placed on it in the context of the new 2017 release. Okay, so as I've already mentioned, the EUM Primer was originally released in 2008. Again, the work that was done took place in 2006, 2007, getting to the point of having the material for the Primer. Re-released here, and on the right-hand side here is a screenshot of the cover of the 2017 document, and it has already been mentioned. It's quote a go-to document for effective utility management. So, you know, some key things to sort of think about in terms of background on the Primer. First, it walks utilities through some easy steps to highlight strengths and areas for improvement. Jim Horn earlier characterized it as simple but not simplistic. It's designed to help utilities in a replicable way and in an objective way get a snapshot of operations. It can be used as a strategic planning framework, and the actual self-assessment, which I'll step through in a little bit, provides what I'd say is a high-level view of the utility that can certainly kickstart more detailed strategic planning. But the 10 attributes themselves can act as a very strong overall framework for strategic planning at an organization. It's not designed, EUM and the Primer, it's not designed to dictate priorities for utilities. It fully recognizes that priorities are going to be context specific and sort of operating environment specific to utilities. So again, it's designed to be very flexible in its implementation. And then just to note that the Primer does include measures that drinking water and wastewater utilities can use to assess performance. and those measures are organized around the 10 attribute areas. I'll talk more about those measures a little bit later in the broadcast. We did want to note as part of this that EUM is the backbone of awards programs for both NAWA, so the NAWA's Excellence in Management Award, and for AWWA's Platinum Award for Utility Excellence and their Gold Award for Exceptional Utility Performance. Both NAWA and AWWA adopted the EUM framework soon after the original primer in 2008 was released, and they've continued to use it as the framework and backbone for their awards programs. So in terms of how other utilities have utilized EUM, and Liesl did a really nice job of explaining how both the context within which they decided to use it, that acquisition that they were involved in, but also how they brought it in to support and be overall their strategic planning framework. But what we've seen in terms of how utilities have been utilizing EUM, a way to assess current operations and identify areas for improvement, framework for creating a new strategic plan or updating an existing strategic plan. So we often have seen utilities that have already been well into strategic planning bring EUM in as a way to structure their plan going forward consistent with this industry initiative. They've also found it, and this is the next bullet, as a strong tool to communicate utility needs to board members, local leaders, customers, and community stakeholders. But we've also seen utilities actually use the EUM framework in the context of engaging with community stakeholders or board members or local leaders, so inviting them into the assessment process. That's one of the nice aspects of the, quote, simple but not simplistic aspect of EUM, is that it's something that people who are not engaged in running utilities day to day can get their heads around pretty easily. So it's really been a very effective both engagement and communication framework. It's definitely set in a continual improvement context, so it will fit very well within any continual improvement effort that you have. It can also help to initiate a continual improvement effort. It's also definitely set up to help you align goals with practices and measures, and we'll talk a bit more about practices and measures a little bit later. So again, that classic drop down within a strategic planning framework. And the final thing is a framework to establish and deploy internal cross-departmental teams. We've seen many of utilities that have implemented EUM have done it in a cross-functional team context. So they have farmed out the assessment to cross-functional teams, let them work through the assessment, and then come back and compare results. So I'd like to move next to the EUM self-assessment exercise and describe it. And again, this is provided in the January 2017 primer, and there's good solid directions in there and everything you need to implement. So I'll just touch on the highlights here. So the self-assessment is designed as sort of the first step in implementing EUM. It's designed to help you evaluate at a high level the 10 attributes or your sort of performance and priorities relative to those 10 attributes. A variety of ways that it can be completed. It can be done individually by a utility manager. It can be done in a team setting. And as I mentioned, it can be also farmed out to external stakeholders, other decision makers within the community, board members, whatever it might be. And it's section 4 of the primer that focuses and provides a detailed in-depth description of the exercise. Also in Appendix B of the primer, there is a blank copy of the self-assessment worksheet that you can copy and then use to work in a team context. So within the context of the self-assessment, the first step is to assess your current conditions, and this is relative to the 10 attributes. So what it sets up is individuals would go through and look at the current level of achievement for each attribute. Basically, how are we doing on this right now? We provide within the primer some ways of thinking about how to rate current level of achievement in each attribute, and that's presented here on the screen. So a rating of 1, which is the highest rating, is effective, systematic approach and implementation, consistently achieving goals. Something that I want to note here that you'll see in terms of these rating criteria is that there's 2 parts to this, and I'll stay focused on sort of a 1 rating: effective, systematic approach and implementation. So that says that there's a management system in place supporting the attribute, and it's fully implemented, and you believe it to be effective. The second thing says consistently achieve goals. So this is asking what's the actual performance in the attribute area. And the idea here is that performance without a systematic management approach in place might represent good luck rather than a reliable ability to deliver over time. And then a really good system that isn't giving you what you need in terms of achieving your goals suggests that maybe it isn't such a good system. So again, we ask that you be thinking both about what is the systemic support to the attribute, but also how are you doing from the standpoint of what outcomes you would like to be producing. All right, so the second step, so again, what we suggest in terms of implementing the assessment is that you go all the way through the 10 attributes and you do your rating of your current conditions. And then you come back around to talk about ranking the importance of the attributes. And here, it's set up as a forced ranking exercise. So, you can say, when you choose currently what is your most important attribute, you assign that a 1. And then 1's done. And so the next thing you need to do is find what do you believe the attribute is that's second most important, and assign that a 2, and on down through 10. Forced ranking exercises make some people uncomfortable. And there was a lot of discussion among the utilities that were the steering group that contributed to the development of the primer about whether we should encourage forced ranking, and they landed on a yes. Obviously, if this doesn't suit the culture of your organization, you can modify that and decide to say, no, you're allowed to use a rank more than once. The nice part about forced ranking is it forces a lot of discussion and thought, and doesn't allow an easy out in terms of prioritization. So again, that's why we encourage using that forced ranking. So once you've completed the rating and then the ranking, this is a screenshot of the top part of the assessment sheet that's provided. And what you'll see here is that we have product quality and customer satisfaction lined up here. A couple of things to note in this slide. So the first is that, so they've rated achievement as a 3. So they either have some system deficiencies or they have some outcome deficiencies or some combination of those that led them to say, we're not happy with where we're at. and they've ranked product quality as #1 in terms of performance. Now, something to note here is the next one down, customer satisfaction, you'll see is rated from an achievement standpoint as a 5, which is the lowest. And so they clearly have concerns about how they're doing on customer satisfaction. But you'll also note that they've ranked the importance as a 4. So one of the things to stress here is that we really very much see the rating exercise and the ranking exercise as independent. So it's not necessarily the case that just because something has received the lowest rating that it by definition would be the highest priority for the utility. If these product quality deficiencies, for example, relate to compliance challenges, series of near misses, for example, then there's a real reason for that to be a higher priority than customer satisfaction, potentially. Again, this will all be utility specific. One final note here is you'll see that each of these attributes has more than one bullet point associated with it. So for product quality, we have meets or exceeds regulatory and reliability requirements. We also have operates consistent with customer, public health, economic, and ecological needs. So, you know, the first bullet is very much related to industry standards and regulatory standards and how are you doing in meeting them. The second bullet is very much related to service levels that might be driven by specific customer expectations, local public health needs that may go beyond regulatory minimums, as well as ecological needs, again, that may go beyond regulatory minimums. So as you might expect, you might be doing very well from a regulatory standpoint, but possibly service levels set outside of that context, you might not be doing quite as well on. So, you know, the question is then, well, which of the two bullet points here is the governing factor for rating and ranking? What we say is you can do a couple of things. You can do each bullet and then average what comes back, or you can use the lowest rated bullet of the series of bullets under each attribute and choose that. Typically, when we've worked directly with utilities, we've encouraged them to take that latter approach, which is whichever bullet comes back as your lowest rated bullet, use that to set your rating. That's a conservative approach, obviously, but again, we've kind of felt that it's the easiest to explain, as well as provides the most sort of protective outcome that you could have. So once you've completed the assessment, so both the rating and the ranking, you're then asked to move this into a matrix format. And I'm sure just from the picture here, and again, this is a screenshot from the actual primer, this is very straightforward. It's just designed to help visually highlight what will be your attributes of highest interest. So in this case, employee and leadership development, which has a rating of 4 and a ranking of 2, is plotted on this graph, and it winds up in the orange highlighted cells of the matrix. So anything that lands in those orange highlighted cells is by definition your high priority attributes. And what you see here is for this particular utility, there's just one, employee and leadership development. There's also product quality, which is sitting in the yellow highlighted area, which is also, again, an area of importance. As you move lower down and to the right in the matrix, those attributes are less significant from the standpoint of needing immediate attention from the utility standpoint. So I want to stress again, going back to Jim's words, simple but not simplistic. Again, as you can see, this is something that can be readily communicated and allows you to readily engage with non-technical audiences and audiences that may not be that sophisticated from the standpoint of understanding your operations. Okay, so this is just a a full depiction of some example results that a utility could produce, and I've already described kind of the plotted zones here that have been set up. Again, it's just a way to simply and in a visual manner present the results that you've had. So the next step, so coming off of the self-assessment, one thing that I'll mention is, as we've worked with utilities, when they have farmed it out, so for example, we know some utilities that had their entire leadership team individually complete a self-assessment independently from each other. So they might have had 15 people, they all fill it out, those get submitted, and then they compile the results in a spreadsheet typically, and they're able to look at where there's been consistency and where there's inconsistency in the results among the leadership members. And typically then what they do is come together, convene, and talk through the results, and talk through the results together, and look to reach a consensus on how they want to rate and rank the outcomes. So it becomes a very collaborative exercise. And as you might expect, people from different parts of the organization, from finance, from operations, from infrastructure management, wherever it might be, potentially have different takes. One, they may have a greater detailed knowledge in certain attribute areas than others. But they also, again, may have different takes on how the utility is doing overall, and this helps to really drive some cohesion into the management vision for what's important for the organization. So my understanding is we're going to take a break for questions right now, and then we'll move into the next part of the broadcast.
Great. Yes,
okay.
Thank you, Rob. We just had a few quick questions that came in regarding the self-assessment, so we figured we'd take those now. In talking about the self-assessment, if you are a combined system, should you use the self-assessment for your drinking water and wastewater collectively, or conduct a self-assessment for both operations separately?
Yeah, so what I've typically suggested is that be done separately. So if you're a combined system, do one on the wastewater side and one on the water side. The reason for that is, infrastructure conditions, operational conditions, financial conditions might be very different between the two. At the same time, if in particular there's an existing unified strategic plan in place across the combined utility, then I'd suggest that you look to maintain that and conduct the self-assessment exercise across both operations. So I think it in part has to do with the the current planning context that you're operating in. I mean, I typically see distinct capital plans, for example, for water and wastewater in the combined utility context. And that alone then tends to drive me to say, conduct self-assessment separately.
Great, that's very helpful. And then along the same lines, when conducting the self-assessment, is it typically geared towards larger systems, or can smaller systems use the same framework as well?
Yeah, so it's designed to be very user-friendly and apply across a full range of system contexts. So that's geographic context, size context, community, urban rural context. But I will mention that EPA and USDA have been running a partnership for about 5 years that's focused on small and rural utilities. And there's a separate guide that was developed. It's based on the 10 attributes, although they're in that context, they're referred to as management areas. And it's a slightly modified approach, which is designed to be a little bit easier to implement and is, I guess, sort of toned down a bit from the standpoint of expectations that might be created. Recognizing that, in the small system context, there may not need to be some of the things that you would be doing in a medium or large system context. And here, when I'm talking about small systems, we've implemented workshops and worked directly with systems that have had 100 connections, for example. So we're not necessarily talking about the classic 3,000 connection break, but all the way down to super small community and other systems.
Great, yes, that's very helpful. I think that's all we have for right now. We have a couple more that we'll get into later, but we'll let you get back to the rest of the presentation.
Okay. All right, thank you. So so where we'd like to go next is within the context of the primer. After the self-assessment, there's an implementation section of the primer that's focused on, okay, so what do you do next now that you have these results? And this graphic shows up, and so it shows the self-assessment at the top, and then shows you driving down into strategic business planning, and then into implementation of effective practices and onto measurement. So I'd like to, I'll talk through these a bit here. But one thing that I wanted to note is, and this in part can have to do with the existing planning context within the organization, as well as the size and overall operating context of the organization, how much strategic planning, particularly long-range strategic planning, is seen as necessary. So that we have definitely seen utilities that move directly from self-assessment into implementation, and have not gone then into more in-depth strategic business planning. So the self-assessment is designed to both sort of provide a framework for and help you drop into more detailed strategic business planning, but it can also help, depending on the utility context, just bypass the strategic business planning piece and move right into implementation of effective practices. One last thing here is, we stress that this is very much designed to be reflective of a continual continual improvement management process, and that's very much reflected in this graphic. So here, as you'll remember, in terms of our example utility, they landed on employee and leadership development as the area where they would most benefit from focus. There's also product quality here, as well as the resiliency attribute. What is recommended in the primer is that a utility take on no more than 1 to 3 attributes in terms of really trying to push forward. I think any of you that have been involved in the strategic planning process know that, pardon me, the initial outcome of a strategic planning process often creates a very long laundry list of possible goals, strategies, and actions, and that can swamp the boat at even the best of organizations. So the need to say, okay, that's all great, but what capacity do we really have to implement new initiatives going forward over the next 1, 2, or 3 years, and how do we best focus our efforts? So the expectation here is not that any utility would have, kind of be moving forward on all 10 attributes simultaneously, that you would choose carefully, consistent with the organization's capacity to plan and implement effectively. So within the primer, this separate guide is referenced. It's a guide that's related to the implementation of effective practices and measures. One thing I'll note is that this guide, which you'll see was issued in 2014, is currently under revision. It's not being substantially revised, but it is being revised to be fully consistent and trued up with the 2017 primer. And the target date for re-release of the updated roadmap is October of this year, so we're pretty close. But in the meantime, the existing roadmap will provide very useful information. So the concept of the roadmap was to dock with the attribute framework of EUM, and once a utility had identified 1 or 2 or 3 attributes as areas that they would like to work on, that this document, then the roadmap, would become a ready reference for example practices that the utility could consider implementing as a way to improve its performance in the attribute areas. So what you'll see, and I'll show a little more detail here in a minute, but what you'll see in this document is example practices. These, again, come from utilities in the sector. This document was put together by a working group of utility managers, and they carefully vetted under each of the attribute areas practices, and again, very careful not to represent these as best practices or the practices. It's example practices that's helped to stimulate discussion within your organization about what you could be doing, as well as to reinforce potentially what you're already doing as you take a look and say, hey, we're already doing many of these. Another key aspect of the roadmap is that it too is kind of built within the context of continual improvement. So the practices for each attribute are organized under 3 levels, level 1, level 2, and level 3. These levels are not designed to, again, suggest that a utility is not performing appropriately or well if it's not at level 3. But it was more designed to represent a sense of what is the core business strategy of the utility. So level 1 relates to a utility whose core business strategy relates to providing adequate fundamental services. So that's the utility that just says, you know what, we're here to, deliver reliably quality product consistent with the regulatory obligations that we have, as well as our customer expectations. So providing adequate fundamental services, that's level 1. Level 2 is optimizing operations and services. What this level represents is a utility that has moved itself pretty assertively into a continual improvement management environment. It sees opportunity to go beyond providing basic services and just basically meeting regulatory minimums. It's an organization that's probably looking very, very hard at how it can continually drive down costs of chemicals, of energy, how it can best deploy its assets over the long run to sort of optimize itself financially. So again, it's an organization that has really moved down that path of day-to-day, of a culture of day-to-day continual improvement. The third level that's represented in the document relates to and is labeled as transforming operations and services for the future. So this would be a utility that has adopted a business strategy that says we are looking substantially, number 1, at different business models for our utility. So, for example, on the wastewater side, moving strongly into resource recovery, and this would be energy. This would be nutrients. This would be water. So again, really down the path, probably getting into some form of enhanced digestion. So again, bringing in high-strength wastes from outside of the utility. It's also an organization that's decided that it wants to be highly engaged in its community and in its watershed. So to be a real leader in terms of overall watershed stewardship, and be very much an anchor institution within its community from the standpoint of economic development. This business strategy is very reflective of what's been labeled utility of the future. And again, so practices that are represented around that business strategy, again, tend to be pretty advanced practices. Now, again, there's no judgment passed on these 3 levels, but the practices are arrayed relative to each of those 3 levels within the context of each of the attributes. All right, so I know you'll need to get into that document a bit to, fully get your heads around this notion of the 3 levels of business strategy, but they're very fundamental to the presentation of the material. So this next slide is a screenshot from the roadmap. This is in the attribute area, employee and leadership development practices. And what you'll see on the left-hand column, it says level 1. So this is level 1, providing adequate fundamental services. And then the structure, and this structure is replicated under each of the attributes and under each of the levels. You'll see there's a practice statement. So at the very top, practice statement related to workplace culture. And there's a statement about workplace culture, which is very much phrased towards it being an outcome. So clarity is established for all job responsibilities and functions. And then a series of example practices, in this case, 5 example practices are provided. And then you'll see you move on to the next practice statement, recruitment, retention, and succession. And again, we have here 5 example practices listed, and then another practice statement, development opportunities. Each of the practice statement areas, for example, workplace culture, are repeated at each level. What's different is the nature of the statement that's provided on workplace culture advances as you move to level 2 and to level 3, and the example practices advance as you move to level 2 and level 3. All right, so moving off of the roadmap, and I'll just make one last observation about the roadmap. The roadmap, the way that it's set up is it can be very much used as a group exercise where you could have, for example, a cross-functional team come in, go into the employee and leadership development section, and work through the example practices that are provided at each of the levels, level 1, level 2, and level 3. And again, it's designed to provide ready access to some ideas about practices, but also to potentially help affirm your level of comfort that you're implementing a full suite of practices that that other utility managers have said, hey, these are important to be considering and possibly using. So the next slide here talks about some other references that are important for you to be aware of. So here we've highlighted Appendix C in the guide, attribute-related water utility measures. And you'll see at the bottom of this screenshot of this page, you'll see product quality listed there. And then there's it moves into a series of measures. So again, this appendix in the primer for each of the attributes provides a series of example measures. Now those measures are drawn from, many of them are drawn from existing industry efforts by AWWA, by WEF, and other organizations. Some of them came from the work group that helped put this together. So it's a combination. And again, these are example measures. We're no way looking to dictate that these would be used. So after selecting measures, so again, we've kind of stepped through here. You've done the self-assessment. You've taken a look, potentially you've used the roadmap to think about effective practices that you can put in place or that you can continue to implement. You've taken a look at the appendix to understand measurement opportunities, and you've selected measures. And now you're into implementing and looking to reflect and adjust. So I'd just like to mention a couple of resources that are available, and then we'll have an opportunity for some further questions. So if you want to advance, there we go. Good. So we've repeatedly mentioned throughout this broadcast effective utility management, the primer released in January 2017. You'll see on the bottom there all of the collaborating/endorsing organizations. So the primer is that's the go-to document. It's your place to start if you're interested in EUM. There's also watereum.org. It's a website that the collaborating organizations have put up. And if you go there, there's a whole series of references. One of the nice parts about the website is that under each of the attribute areas, it provides reference materials, so it's organized in that way. So if you're particularly interested in product quality, you can go in and you'll see more detailed industry resources and tools that can help you advance product quality at your utility. Here's another screenshot of the roadmap document, and again, I've already mentioned that this document is in the process of being updated, re-release October 2017. And finally, we have two benchmarking resources: a WRF, Water Research Foundation benchmarking material, and AWWA also benchmarking resources. But one thing I'll mention is measures that are included within the primer draw on both of these documents, but they go into considerably more breadth and depth with respect to providing some further information that will support your implementation around effective utility management. Finally, just to mention that each of the collaborating organizations feature a variety of EUM-related resources and programs on their websites. And then they also link to the watereum.org website. So Stephanie, we'll turn back to you for questions. That takes care of the slides that I needed to go through today.
Very good. Thank you, Rob, for that excellent presentation and stepping us through the components and exercises related to the EUM Primer. As we mentioned, we do have a couple of questions that we can go through now, and the first one that we came through is regarding the time frame on what needs to be established for rating and ranking. As we know, the implementation cycle is continuously rolling continuously, but what time frame should be set for rating and ranking?
Stephanie, I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of the question?
Sure. The inquirer was asking what time frame needs to be established for rating and ranking the components within the framework.
Okay, so if I understand the question, yeah, so the assessment is designed to provide a snapshot of current operations. So, you know, in terms of you saying, okay, how are we doing? It's not, you wouldn't be, you know, asking how do we think we'll be doing in 5 years? You'll be saying, how are we doing currently? So it's a current snapshot in terms of the self-assessment. When you move from the self-assessment into thinking about practices, obviously the step that needs to be taken is to say, all right, where do we want to go in terms of this now high priority attribute area? And there, and Lisa, you know, you can speak to this. I think you said during your presentation that you've decided to use a 3-year time frame in terms of setting your goals. And I think that anywhere between 2 and 5 years, it would be a typical period of time that people would be looking at. But Lisa, do you want to maybe jump in on that?
Sure, I can respond to that. I believe for the assessment piece, at least for us, I mean, the assessment went pretty quickly for the internal part of it. Employees are very well aware of how our organization is functioning and what's important to us. So getting the assessment results done, what was, as Rob said, a snapshot in time and came together very quickly. And I think that for us anyway, and probably for most organizations, those rankings especially are going to be fairly stable over time. So if you do the assessment this year and next year and the year after that, for the most part, the things that are most important to you are going to continue to be most important to you. And really, it's the time horizon that you want to place on how, your strategic planning, how far ahead that you can look, how far ahead that you can set targets for your strategic measures, and what makes sense for your organization. We did 3 years because we thought that's about as far ahead as we felt comfortable looking.
Great, that helps a lot in terms of establishing time frame. Lisa, we had another question come in for you. How broadly did the self-assessment apply within your organization in terms of the number of employees, and then how did you analyze those results?
Sure. We have 160 employees, and about 30 of them are in some kind of manager, supervisory, or functional leadership type role. And so we had 100% participation from that group on the assessment. And then we did some employee meetings and talked about results and provided a worksheet for all employees to participate in. And out of the remaining 130 or so employees, we had maybe 20% participate in that to validate the results. For the most part, though, it was the management team, that group of 30 managers, who created sort of the first pass at what the goals and the ranking and ratings were. And then we use the assessment tool with employees more as a way to validate that we hit the right things and that we hit the right targets. The board meetings, or the interaction with our board of directors, has been a little bit more continuous. When we get in front of the board and do a quarterly or type of goal update, we're sort of always asking, are these still the right priorities? And try to get them to nod yes, or give us feedback that there's something that we missed.
Great. Yes, that's very helpful in terms of interaction with the board too, because I know several others have asked, how do you deal with establishing those goals when they are limited by the elected body or by a board of directors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the board of directors for Lehigh County Authority is relatively engaged in our process, and we meet twice a month, so we have a fair amount of exposure with our board as far as operationally what's going on and what the challenges are that we're facing. So for us to present the 4 attributes that we wanted to focus on, for the most part, the board was able to identify those and say, yes, those are the most important things. However, as time goes on and things happen out in the community, they have come back to us with other priorities that they've said are more important. For example, some of our board members are very active in environmental circles in our community and have brought some initiatives back to us that fit more within the water supply adequacy attribute, which we did not identify as one of our top 4 that we wanted to focus on. But it's important to the community and it's important to our board. So we have some other side initiatives that we're doing that fit within that attribute.
Great, thank you. Rob, we have a question that could be directed towards you. Can you provide more information on how the EUM framework is linked with capacity development planning, specifically interest related to technical, managerial, and financial framework?
Yeah, so I think what people will find if they're sort of operating within the that Safe Drinking Water Act driven management framework, that the attributes align with each, are easily aligned with those three pillars. So from the managerial standpoint, we have the attributes that relate to the management of operations. In terms of the technical standpoint, there are attributes that are focused on, for example, product quality and infrastructure resilience. And then from the financial standpoint, we have the financial viability area. So there's not a direct one-to-one mapping, but the coverage is very similar, and again, they're kind of easily aligned. So Stephanie, back to you.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I was on mute. This can really go to any of the speakers. Can you speak to the importance of transparency to achieving buy-in of teams and successful implementation? So Lisa kind of talked about it a little bit with the board of directors, but if you have any other guidance that you can offer the utilities, that would be helpful.
I'll jump in on that one a little bit, just to expand on the board interaction. I would say that between both the board and the employees, having this goal-setting process, the measures, establishing the measures, this entire strategic planning process has been helpful in ways that go beyond just completing the strategic planning, really raising the awareness of the needs of the organization in the categories that we've selected. For example, financial viability and infrastructure sustainability are great examples where we've identified through this dialogue some real key needs that we have in terms of maintaining our infrastructure and getting caught up on some asset management initiatives. And that really has helped to drive support for things like addressing our rates and potentially including an asset management kind of component into our rate making philosophy, as well as simply getting projects funded and approved, because it fits within the structure that we've been talking with our board about and our employees about kind of on a routine basis.
Stephanie, this is Rob. In terms of what we've seen in terms of implementation, one of the key things is, what is the utility's strategy overall in terms of its engagement with the board, with its broader community, and for that matter, throughout its organization. And there are different organizational cultures out there. What I always just encourage is just be deliberate and intentional about whatever your transparency is going to be. So, if you're deciding you're not going to be transparent, why, and then you're acting consistently with that. What I would say is, for organizations that have either placed a premium on transparency with different constituencies, or believe that they would like to increase transparency, that this framework is very helpful in that context, that it can really help in a kind of a non-technical way explain what's needed to run a utility well over time and to engage those stakeholders effectively. So I think it's not, using it is not dependent on a certain level of transparency or not. This can be done all internally, just among a senior executive team, if that's the management culture of an organization. But I think it really can help quite a bit for those organizations that either put a premium on transparency and or would like to increase.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. And then along those lines, do you both have recommendations on which fields or groups should be involved in the original assessment team, such as finance, HR, or specific operations?
At Lehigh County Authority, we took a broad approach and included everyone. So we felt that that was appropriate for our organization and the goals that we were trying to achieve with this process.
And Stephanie, I'll just speak from what we've seen other utilities do, and it's very much mirrored what Lisa just described. Is they've tended to be more rather than less inclusive, and certainly reach to kind of the entire management team. So engineering, operations, finance, HR, all those functional areas to bring them in, IT. So there's definitely been a sense of more inclusiveness.
Great, thank you. And then Rob, as you've worked with a number of the utilities, do you have an idea of what percentage of water, wastewater agencies have adopted the EUM framework?
We don't have any ready numbers on that. So I can't say. What I will say is that it's been more and more common for us to just look at, for example, strategic plans of organizations around the country and see embedded in them EUM. Literally yesterday, I was just looking at the strategic planning materials of a large utility, a combined utility, and everything from the board vision down to their annual business goals seem to be lifted from EUM in terms of the language that's being used in the framework. I'm just seeing more and more of that. So there is a sense that it's kind of permeating the sector in sort of an increasingly or sort of gathering increasing momentum within the sector.
Very good, thank you. We did have one individual that asked if there was any scheduled workshops coming up to attend. And I know that AWWA is hosting an effective utility management seminar later in August in California. We'd direct you to the AWWA website to find more information, but I know many of the participating organizations involved with the EUM framework are hosting workshops and opportunities to get together and talk. So we'd encourage you to check out the websites for all the participating organizations. And then likewise, one question asked if the associations have any key benchmarking data for the utilities to compare their activities. I'm personally involved with the benchmarking program here at AWWA, and through a number of the questions that we ask, we incorporate many of the metrics that tie to the EUM framework. Not all entirely, but many of the metrics are asked and gather and collect data from there. So we'd encourage your participation in that as well, or feel free to contact myself or any of the organizations or the speakers regarding opportunities for that collection of data. I think that's about all the time we have for questions right now. For the most part, we've addressed everything that's come in. If we haven't addressed your questions, then we'll try to circle back with you following the webinar. But again, we want to thank everyone for their participation. Thanks to our panel for their expertise and their knowledge in moving us forward. This concludes our webinar on effective utility management and utilities road to sustainability. But before we go, we hope you can join us at one of our upcoming webinars. On August 16th, there will be Infrastructure Finance Series, Utility Integration of Private Financing. On August 22nd, How to Implement Utility Climate Action Plans. And on August 24th, What Tool is the Right Tool? Pipe Diagnostics and Cleaning, sponsored by AWWA and Carolyn. You can find out more about the upcoming conferences on AWWA's website and the link provided on the slide shown. And on behalf of AWWA, we want to thank you for joining the webinar today. Please don't forget to participate in the survey immediately following the webinar. We look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Until next time, thank you for keeping the water safe and secure.